Welcome to History Doc.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're taking a really focused, completely impartial look at one of the absolute defining events of modern history, the September 11 attacks. Now, our goal here isn't to just rehash the timeline of what happened on that specific day. Instead, we're going to unpack its incredibly complex legacy and the massive global consequences that followed. We'll be looking closely at the original intent behind the attacks and contrasting that with the actual, and sometimes totally unintended, impacts on our world over the last 2 decades. Think back to 2001. The United States was, arguably, at the absolute peak of its global power. The Cold War was in the rearview mirror, and the international system honestly seemed pretty stable. And then, this spectacular, highly coordinated attack just shattered that entire illusion. So to understand exactly how that single morning completely shifted global geopolitics, we need to take a structured approach. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The motives for the attacks. 2. A crisis of democratic trust. 3. China's strategic window. 4. The Middle East and identity. And 5. The true paradigm shift. All right, Section 1, the motives for the attacks, unpacking the intent. So, to really grasp the legacy here, we first have to look objectively at the historical facts. If we walk through the timeline, there are a few key events that really build the foundation for Al-Qaeda's motivations. In a 2004 video, Osama bin Laden specifically pointed back to the 1982 Lebanon War, claiming that seeing towers destroyed there is actually what planted the idea in his mind. Fast forward to 1990, during the Gulf War, when the US stationed troops in Saudi Arabia, which is home to Islam's holiest sites. That permanent military presence absolutely infuriated bin Laden. And by 1998, this culminated in Al-Qaeda issuing a formal fatwa. It was essentially a declaration of war, making it an individual duty for their followers to target Americans. When we look clinically at Al-Qaeda's explicitly stated motives, and we're primarily pulling this from bin Laden's 2002 letter to the American people, we see a very specific list of grievances. They heavily cited U.S. support for Israel, the devastating impact of UN sanctions against Iraq, and of course, the continued presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. But interestingly, they also pointed to the United States' refusal to sign the Kyoto Protocol, literally blaming the U.S. for environmental destruction, while also condemning what they viewed as American cultural immorality. But here's where things get really interesting. Political analysts draw a pretty sharp line between what Al-Qaeda explicitly stated and what their overarching long-term strategic goals likely were. While the stated motives were all about vengeance for foreign policy and liberating Muslim lands, the inferred motives point to something highly calculated. Scholars like Michael Scott Doran argue that the real goal was to provoke a massive American overreaction. By baiting the U.S. into heavily intervening in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda was hoping to unite the Muslim world against the West and spark a giant pan-Islamist revolution. Section 2. A crisis of democratic trust. The fracturing of the West. So, if the attacker's goal was to provoke an overreaction, we have to look at how the United States actually responded. Did that response achieve American strategic goals, or did it inadvertently fracture the West? In a debate hosted by the Lowy Institute, expert Emma Skye makes a really compelling point. She notes that, in its response to the 9/11 attacks, the United States undermined the rules-based international order. She specifically points to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Because they were unable to get UN Security Council approval, the US ended up bypassing the exact same international system that it helped build. Skye argues that the ensuing war on terror, with all its controversies over torture and due process, deeply harmed America's international reputation as the ultimate standard-bearer of democracy. And, this perfectly captures the domestic fallout as well. As London School of Economics professor Michael Cox explains, the Iraq War was initially pitched as this cornerstone of spreading democracy, but it quickly began to go badly wrong. And when a lack of trust in a specific policy segues into a complete distrust of whether established politicians are even competent, well, it creates a massive political void. Cox argues that the failures of these forever wars severely eroded public trust, which effectively opened the door for this huge wave of global populism and nativism that we see impacting elections in Western democracies right now. Section 3. China's strategic window. The shift in global power. Now, what's really fascinating about this angle is that while the conflict was heavily centered in the Middle East, it completely altered the balance of power in Asia. Yoon Sun from the Stimson Center points out that right before 9/11, the incoming Bush administration was already starting to define China as a strategic competitor. But the attacks changed everything. Sun states, 9/11 offered what Beijing defined as a window of strategic opportunity to develop its strength while the United States was acutely distracted. The sheer trillions of dollars and the massive strategic focus poured into the Middle East effectively delayed the US from focusing on a rising China for an entire decade. On top of that, this whole global war on terror narrative gave Beijing surprisingly convenient diplomatic cover domestically. Because the entire world was suddenly united under this banner of fighting terrorism, China was able to frame its really harsh domestic policies against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang as just necessary counter-terrorism measures. By actually getting certain Uyghur groups placed on US terrorist exclusion lists, Beijing managed to dodge heavy international scrutiny regarding human rights abuses for years. Section 4, Middle East and Identity. Cascading regional chaos. Let's pivot and look at the direct impact on the region that was obviously most affected, the Middle East. Experts Anatol Lieven and Emma Skye lay out how the U.S. decision to dismantle the Iraqi state apparatus unintentionally created a massive, gaping power vacuum. And that chaos allowed Al-Qaeda to establish a real foothold in Iraq, which eventually morphed into ISIS. This shifting balance of power also escalated major proxy conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which ultimately fed into the brutal Syrian civil war, displacing millions and triggering a historic refugee crisis over in Europe. The regional impacts were just colossal and completely compounding. But honestly, beyond the strict geopolitics, the cultural impact was just staggering. Farah Pandith, who is a former U.S. State Department official, observes, the 1/4 of human civilization that is Muslim underwent a new scrutiny based on religious affiliation. So the crucial point here is that a tiny minority of bad actors fundamentally changed how millions of regular people have to navigate their daily lives. From a heightened fear of hate crimes to the heavy psychological burden of constantly having to prove your innocence, the attacks triggered this massive generational wave of us versus them mentalities across the globe. Section 5, the true paradigm shift, 21st century geopolitics. So with all of that on the table, we really have to step back and ask, what is the ultimate legacy here? Let's quickly recall our baseline. The unipolar moment was this idea that, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States sat completely unchallenged at the very top of the global order. Liberal democratic capitalism was seen as the definitive blueprint for the future. It was a firm belief in undeniable US primacy. Well, historian Andrew Bacevich comes right out and completely challenges that baseline. He argues, the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon set in motion events that exposed US claims of global primacy as fraudulent. According to Bacevich, the failed wars that followed the attacks basically proved that overwhelming military power couldn't just easily force outcomes or impose democracy. So instead of cementing American dominance, the US response actually accelerated the decline of that unipolar moment, and it hastened the arrival of the multipolar world we're living in today, a world where no single nation-state completely dominates. Anatol Lieven really drives this point home. He argues that despite the absolute horror of 9/11, terrorism actually isn't the defining factor of our era. The real defining threats of the 21st century are things like great power competition between the US and China, the escalating realities of climate change, widening socioeconomic inequality, mass global migration, and massive technological disruptions like AI. While the US and its allies spent 2 full decades hyper-focused on a war on terror, these massive structural challenges were just quietly continuing to grow largely unchecked. And that brings us to our final thought. Looking at all the evidence and the expert analyses we've mapped out today, we're left with one seriously provocative question. Did 9/11 actually change the world? Or did our reaction to it simply distract us from the real defining threats of the 21st century? As we navigate this new era of multipolar competition and wild technological change, understanding the difference between the impact of an event and the impact of our reaction to it has literally never been more crucial. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.
Like this video, share with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to History Doc.